You walk on the streets of Shanghai, when you walk on the streets of Manhattan, say, and you ask which one is the developed country, it looks more like Shanghai would be. I don't think bigger is endlessly better. There are constraints about it. This is a core issue. If you regulate that nobody can use it or very few can use it or the permissions are too strict, then that hampers innovation, there's a common good aspect. But you see it also in this virus discussion, this protection of privacy, and what happened to the idea that what's good for the community. The aggregation of data gives us much more understanding of illnesses. If everybody can say that, no, I don't want to be part of that data set, that may be costly for the society. The value of data and the value of aggregation of data, the value of using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to create predictions and analyze the data.
To seek that balance fundamentally between digital economy and personal privacy.
So yes, China, by virtue of its size, in that sense, a favored role, huge access to data, and data is becoming very valuable. I mean, data is a source of new wealth, that's clear.
It's a source of new wealth, but it's also new productivity in the AI-led economy. What does that mean, coming decade of US-China competition? The US is fantastic in fundamental technologies, but without data and 5G, AI can't rise, and then fourth industrial revolution has nowhere to begin.
Well, these are big questions. So the question is also, how much data do you need? I think there are constraints about it. I'm more concerned about, for instance, Europe, is that the very strict privacy rules will basically limit the possibilities of using sizable databases. Europe is fairly far behind.
Professor Bengt Holmstrom, MIT professor, 2016 Nobel Laureate in economics. Thank you so much for coming on to Hey China.
Thank you for inviting me.
Professor Holmstrom, you are the world's leading mind on corporate governance and contracting theories. So why don't we start with a governance issue? China continues to carry out SOE reform. And if you were to advise the Chinese senior leadership today, what can China do to make the SOE sector more competitive?
I would say the first thing to ask is, why would you want to have an SOE? What is the comparative advantage, as we say, of an SOE relative to a privately held company? And we tend to think in the West that the reason of having a government-owned company is that it wants to pursue some goals that are broader than, say, just wealth maximization or value maximization. And so that may be a reason they could take something like health, defense, or something. It's pretty obvious that the government is much better positioned to own and decide on those matters than do private companies. I would first think very hard in China about why do they want to have SOEs, or why do they want to spin off. One reason for spinning them out into the private sphere is, of course, that we know that the private sphere tends to be more efficient in the sense of providing strong incentives to pursue, say, cost savings or innovation. People are driven by money in part, but also getting satisfaction from being recognized as having invented things. And these are all strong drivers for what happens in the private market. And competition is, of course, a core element of all of this. I think the key is to have consumers have choice. So one of the things that I would think about SOEs is there a way for consumers to have choice in the Western world, that there are garbage collection companies, to take something very trivial, that if they are both public and private, then the public sector becomes pretty efficient because it has to recognize that people have choice. In the US, you can see there are public universities, there are private universities, they are sort of competing with each other. Students have a choice. You can have both public and private companies do the same thing even. They complement each other. So I would say thinking all about why are you doing this is very critical.
So basically, by putting the SOEs on equal footing with private companies in competition, that'll induce competitive advantage in them as well. It's very interesting. Now, Professor Holmstrom, one of the SOE reform agenda in China is currently to turn SOEs and the private companies into a mixed ownership structure. So China aims to create this sort of a hybrid economic species that are partially state-owned and partially privately owned. So I would imagine that this is the first time the world has seen mixed ownership structures in such a massive scale. So is it more economically efficient, you think, by mixing them together, or is it more efficient by keeping them apart?
Public company serves other purposes than the private company typically. They can still sometimes compete, but the purpose of public companies can be such that it has the advantage that it can pursue goals that private companies really cannot very easily pursue. They have different roles to play. Hybrids, one might think, well, let's take the best of both and create a hybrid company, which is better. It takes all the good things from the private side and all the good things from the public side, and then it's a super company, so to speak. I would say the evidence is fairly poor with respect to that kind of view. In fact, what can happen is that you are actually ending up seeing the bad parts of both or something in between. I think there is always a trade-off. You're going to go, any hybrid will be most likely less efficient, but perhaps more equitable or concerned with other issues than just wealth maximization or profit maximization. That when the company maximizes profits, people have the wrong notion sometimes, that they are selfish and disregards workers or disregards society as a whole or disregards suppliers and so on. Milton Friedman wrote, if you have a competitive market, then maximizing shareholder value will all the patrons or all the interest groups will have to take into account the workers. Because if it mistreats workers, then they will not be as valuable as a company. In the end, shareholders will end up paying. You take care of your partners in business and so on, because that's good for your business as well. Don't misconstrue, one shouldn't misconstrue this as, profit maximization somehow completely tilts it in favor of, except when we have, monopolies or very narrow oligopolies and such, then we have a problem potentially. But even now, and this is a very interesting in my view, even now you see that when all the concerns, the political concerns has risen, or the human concerns have risen, say, about climate change, even in that case, it turns out that concern for shareholder value has driven institutional investors to push for reforms where companies really become more conscious about the environment. So these issues, by the political pressures that comes from the general public, every company now is expressing an interest in being conscious about the environment because it's good for business. So even that, in a sense, fits into this notion of Friedman, that political pressures or these public pressures that are very nebulous but powerful.
And speaking of Friedman, he was actually the very first Nobel Laureate that was invited to China.
Oh, I didn't know
in the very early 1980s. The first meeting didn't go quite well, according to his diary.
Yeah, he was very eloquent, but all the strong views. I could see him have issues.
Socialism is actually not unique to China. And we often think that Scandinavian countries adopt a socialist economic structure as well. So how is the Scandinavian model different from the Chinese socialist model?
I do realize that Scandinavian countries are certainly, or Nordic countries as we like to call it. I'm from Finland, so it's not a Scandinavian country, but it's a Nordic country. I wouldn't want to compare the small Nordic countries with say a total population of perhaps 20 million with a giant like China. Running China, it's got to be incredibly much more complicated. There's not that much perhaps to learn from the Nordic countries, except for specific issues, maybe healthcare or something more particular. As a model for how you run your country, I would not try to push it. The similarities are notable in the sense that in China there is a market economy, and China, of course, has been enormously successful in the past 30, 40 years since the opening up, and surprised everybody, probably including itself, by you walk on the streets of Shanghai, when you walk on the streets of Manhattan, say, and you ask which one is the developed country, it looks more like Shanghai would be. It's so modern, and so we can learn in both directions.
In both directions.
Yeah.
Professor Holmstrom, I know that you have been a leading thinker on the global digital governance issues as well. China, in the recent policy planning documents, has named the data as a fundamental factor of production. But data really presents a different set of economic myth in itself, because it's a different kind of input from land, labor, capital, etc. So what are the implications when data becomes the fundamental driver of economic productivity?
I'd like to think also that the value is now in data itself. Of course, its value depends on, how it's being used, like any good, and it transfer data itself isn't information. So there's a distinction between data and information, but information is very valuable. Where information is valuable and so on is going to determine the value of the data. And that's of course true for all goods. In the end, the value of goods depend on how they are used. What's special about data is that it's a non-rival good, meaning that if you use, say, a computer program, then sort of for essentially zero cost, I could also use a copy of that same program. I mean, the copy is a trivial cost. So the marginal cost is trivial. And we can scale it up, sending in an email out 100 million copies of the computer program. And it would be fabulously valuable because 100 million people getting their hands on some program. This is something that certainly is very unusual. If you use some good, say you ate an apple, I can't eat it also. That's a rival good. And the other thing special about data is these network externalities having to do with the aggregation of data using AI and machine learning and digital tools. And I bring my little piece of data, say on a platform like Alibaba's platform, and they start using and combining with your and people, millions of other people. That aggregate data becomes suddenly very valuable. And so all this leads to the question of who should own this data, or how do you sell this data? The fact that it has this tremendous value because it can be replicated at no cost has also an adverse side. When you have sold it to me, that you don't sell it to others that are, for instance, my rivals, to dilute my value. I thought I was getting this as a sort of exclusive deal, if you wish, and then you turn around and sell it to a lot of other parties that I wouldn't like you to sell it to. There's the famous quotient theorem that says, if we just divide the ownership rights correctly, then everything else will sort itself out. I don't think that it is going to play itself out that in the sphere of data. What is the right model about data? Should it be leased, for instance? Should it be rented? You can see that it has already, in the case of, say, Microsoft and all these other companies, we are seeing things, people moved into the cloud, partly for technical reasons, but partly also because it's a leasing model, way that stimulates innovation, but have the adverse selection. So let me mention one more thing, which is worrisome, is there's also the sheer abuse of data and the whole discussion about privacy.
The ownership of the data, in Western understanding at least, it belongs to the consumers. And so as the custodian and the manager of the data, how much of a right of distribution do these tech companies actually have?
Does Amazon have the right to, for instance, collect data, which it does, all our purchases, and without saying anything more, just use it for the purposes of advertising, maybe selling it to some other parties, for their advertising and learning about us as humans, how we behave in particular ways, or subgroups of humans, how we behave. They're optimizing against that knowledge. All sorts of things where we are using. It's not specifically tied to a person. What these algorithms do is basically they stereotype us. They are saying that Bengt Holmstrom is, in his behavior, he belongs to this group. And by the way, if they wanted to, they would quickly figure out that I'm white and male, and they would quickly figure out that I'm Finnish. It's a new form of stereotype. But actually, these computer programs, in a sense, are stereotyping us without revealing individual identities. And so there's a big question of, do they have the right or not? And as I said, Europe takes the view that the data is basically owned individuals, and they have to agree to things. And we all click on these things that I accept it. Because if we don't click, then we don't get what we want. So as individuals, there's a paradox, a privacy paradox, it's called, that is that individuals are less worried about agreeing to all these things because they like to get for free. The trade on this internet is I give access to the data for advertising purposes, other purposes. In exchange, I get the service, which I really like. And individuals on the whole don't care that much about clicking and accept. We all say accept, because if we say not accept, then suddenly we don't get what we want. But
we move back to antiquity.
When we ask people, are you worried about privacy? They express concerns about this. And I think the resolution of this paradox is that they don't care about abuse of their individual data, but they have certain fears about somebody, Facebook or some entity, abusing the whole data set for wrong purposes, which has happened. We have seen it happen, and often political consequences of the use of data, or, it's abused in a collective sense, so against society as opposed to us individuals. We are worried about the aggregation of data more than our individual data. But without aggregation, the value of data isn't there. The value comes from the aggregation.
So are we entering into a world where we will continue to see that the big companies, particularly the big tech companies, are continuing to get bigger, and the ones who do not have the possession of data are going to be marginalized? And are we looking at a polarizing economic world?
That's a possibility. US has a lot of these big firms, and they have very high value. You can see the high value reflects the scalability. That's so easy in the digital world because of the network effects, presumably. They are not able to sort of intrude on each other's territory, so then they don't intrude because they have an implicit agreement that they don't start wars with each other. So you see, Google is still 95% or so a search company. Facebook, it is a social media company. And so you see these specializations in the US. If you look at the Chinese landscape, you see much more of ecosystems competing with ecosystems. So, Alibaba may have originally been on the top of the heap, with its Alipay, for instance, but it did, suddenly WeChat Pay is of the same size. Pinduoduo, come out of nowhere and challenge Taobao. China has a fairly healthy amount of competition, despite the network effects. And maybe it is because they are slicing these pieces differently. But from this, I conclude that it need not be perhaps the case. Sort of we see just monopolies or sort of very strong. It seems possible to have challenges to these big companies, but both in China and in the US, it's so different political systems. On both sides, there's concern about the size of these companies, and both sides seem to be taking steps to reduce the size. US is right now going after Google. No doubt they will go after these other players. And in China, we have seen them go after Alibaba, Ant Group initially, but in their own way, both sides are trying to trim down or ensure competition.
At the same time, they are competing with each other as well. So
yeah, that's the weirdest thing, because they are kind of killing their generals.
But Professor Holmstrom, there has been a lot of calls about establishing a global digital governance framework. And it's probably essential, but looking at prospects that you talked about, different treatment of privacy standards and a different understanding about the usage of data, is there any possibility for China and the Western world to come to any sort of reconciliation in building a compromised global digital standard today?
I don't see that in the cards in the near future, no. We are now seeing two very strong economies. They are competing for who has the ownership of that, or how is it split up. So I don't see in the near future some agreement. Maybe in partial areas like health or virus, or some, you can clearly see it. But in many areas, I think that they will remain very competitive. And there is no Google in China. Now the US is trying to do the same thing to some of the Chinese companies. I think it's more likely that we are going to see somewhat of a more bipolarized world. That would be my forecast.
And so on the digital governance again, we started to see the mismatch today between national sovereignty and digital sovereignty. And so in this whole parallel universe of the digital world, increasingly going to get bigger and more powerful, the digital players, I assume they have an intrinsic role to play in building this common language together. But then how much of a role should the national governments play, or can they play in the future global digital governance structure?
One area where I think is very clearly seen is in the currency area. There's a lot of private money being created. Token economy is developing. Of course, Libra was an example. There was an effort to create a literal currencies that stretches around across borders and so on. And the central banks have clearly reacted. Libra was a wake-up call for them, and they basically shut it down. I think the central banks have the power to in some ways really limit these currencies. True, in the longer term, I think is a very interesting question. Central banks don't want to give up the control of their currency or of their monetary policy and such. Small countries are exposed to the possibility of, let's call it dollarization, but it could equally be, a Chinese currency that eventually will dominate, especially in Asia. I think that's very open, and I think there will be currencies that go across the borders, but will they seriously challenge local currencies? Not in the near future.
On decarbonization, Professor Holmstrom, I know the Nordic countries does provide a global example for the environmental consciousness, but China has just launched a few months ago this ambitious goal to move towards carbon neutrality by 2060. Now, protecting the environment is really not one of the natural desires of private companies. Countries can, I guess, punish bad behaviors by launching a carbon tax, or reward good behaviors by subsidizing funding, or set up market mechanisms via carbon trading. What makes some measures more effective than others?
First of all, I think it's terrific that China has committed itself to carbon neutrality to 2060. China is likely to be fighting this or climate problem hard because large cities, they are really suffering directly from the consequences in large cities. And so they have a very selfish interest, so to speak. They are a world of its own already. They will want to take care of climate change, which is, by the way, more local often than people think. Beijing is a good example. It can have very bad days, and the cities in general. So I think China, in that sense, could be a very much a leader. The thing that's missing in China, at least to some extent, is the public pressure. I may be mistaken on this ground. In Europe, United States, young people especially have sort of really started to express their views about climate change. And we are ready to punish companies that will not be conscious of this climate change. And they have had a big say in how investors now think about it. Investors want their companies to succeed. We'll see their companies very committed to climate change. It's interesting again to see hypothesis that because shareholder-interested company will want to actually take care of climate these days, because there is public pressure to do so, and the investors want to do it. So it's now a win-win for investors and the climate movement. Now, I'm not sure China has the similar amount of public pressure. I don't think it manifests itself through company values as much, at least, because we have the SOEs and other things. So SOEs may not, for instance, naturally live up to this standard. So they may need some special incentives. And I think the natural incentives in all cases still is taxation of some form or some kind of carrot and stick, because we can measure the CO2 emission. I don't see from that aspect, I don't see very different in China than say in the United States. Or
as China moves through this carbon economics forecast for the past few months, there has been a lot of economic debates around the area. On one hand, we see that incremental economic returns on the horizon. But on the other hand, what's going to happen to the traditional sectors who are high carbon emitters? How do we calculate and compensate the cost to the overall economy as they transition? So how do we, as such a large economy such as China's, balance the cost and the future economic growth potential as we move through this whole process?
As I said, there's a carrot and stick aspect that you can do. You can tax emissions, you can subsidize investments in cleaner technology. One of the wonderful things that are happening right now is that as this issue have risen up, and as old technology or the old cycle of energy production has come to its end, it turns out that these new forms of cleaner technologies are actually a lot cheaper. Solar panels, windmills, a variety of other technologies are really becoming competitive today with the traditional, coal burning or oil burning technologies. So the big investments has been made in these new technologies, and we are in this fortunate situation that our old technologies are really sort of, they need to be refurbished. And given that it's quite competitive, clean technology, they are going naturally to go, I think, into clean technology. That part of it be solved fairly easily. So one challenge that remains is that we really have to sort of get rid of some of the carbon that is already in the atmosphere. So this is called carbon capture. And so the carbon capture technology is still uncertain how much it can do. But there's a natural cycle. Carbon goes in, I think it's in the wintertime, it goes up into the atmosphere and then it's absorbed by the plants in the summertime. And so the ideal is not let it go back up again. There's a natural cycle, even if we didn't do anything. And the idea with capture is that you capture it when it's down here in the earth, and you don't let it up in the atmosphere. I may be misrepresenting this, but this is my simplistic view of it. And that's another very interesting direction in which we can actually improve on the state of the atmosphere, at least to some extent.
PBOC's Ma Jun recently wrote that banks, if you want to finance coal sectors, go ahead. There is no law that prevents you from doing so, but the default rate is going to rise from current 3% to 22% in a decade. So you make your own choice. However, the question on the other side of the coin is, if the default rate is as high as 22%, should China just let these companies go into default? What does that again mean for social stability, employment?
Well, that's the trade-off. If you didn't have to worry about the workers, say, or maybe production of electricity or something like that, we would have alternatives. Then, of course, we would just shut them down. They will, in the foreseeable future, be all shut down and replaced. But I'm coming back to the fact that this is the right time. If they are coming to the end of their life, and maybe they have already lived beyond the life. So, yes, you have to be tough with them, is my view. Or then you may, if you feel like you shouldn't be as tough to the workers, then you have to subsidize the workers, and help them move into other more productive places. But as a community, if you want to think of China as a community, I don't know that it's the right metaphor, but as a community, is in the interest of the community and the community of the world. It is of the interest of stopping this pollution. And so whatever it costs to get it done, and whatever means we have to make it easy on people who sort of bear the brunt of the cost, I think there should be a solution to it. In my view, is they need to subsidize, the developing world, because it also wants its share of polluting the world, so to speak. We don't want it, so we have to pay for our former sins.